Hello, my name is Leila Blackbird, and I am one of the History Department's graduate students. My research areas include race and racism, colonialism, global Aboriginal histories, the long civil rights movement, and state violence. I'm currently writing my thesis on Native enslavement and racialization in the New World after contact. So today, I'm going to discuss with you race and slavery in early America through the Revolutionary period. Race relations in early to revolutionary America were complicated and are poorly understood by many people today. It's important to frame the discussion within the context of colonialism. So let's define that. Colonialism is a system that occupies and usurps labor, land, and resources from one group of people for the benefit of another. But there are different types of colonial projects. Exploitation colonialism, for example, involves a small amount of colonists whose main objective is to profit from the colony's resources and then export them to the so-called mother country. Think of the British in India or the Belgians in the Congo. Settler colonialism, which happened across the entire Western Hemisphere in places like Australia, functions through violence, replacing indigenous populations with an invasive settler society. In white settler colonialism, it is land, not labor, that is key first. In this system, indigenous peoples are literally replaced by settlers. As historian and anthropologist Patrick Wolfe puts it, land is life, or at least, land is necessary for life. Thus, contests for land can be and often are contests for life. Plantation colonies, such as those established in colonial Anglo-America and across Spanish America, utilized a mixture of exploitation and settler colonialism in different regions and to different extents. Slavery, the theft of labor, and land theft are therefore inherently intertwined. This in turn leads to the codification of white supremacy into law in the New Republic. So how did early Americans reconcile their Enlightenment ideas such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or freedom from tyranny with the institution of slavery? And how do we now square that circle with race relations? Historian Nicholas Guyot, in his book Bind Us Apart, writes that even the most educated white thinkers at the time didn't know what to do about the issue of slavery. Emancipation seemed like it wouldn't result in racial harmony. The truth is there were a lot of anxieties and fears about the repercussions of slavery. The typical thought process was that abolition wouldn't create an equal society. The most liberal alternative at the time was exile, beyond the Mississippi River or south to Spanish territories. Founders like Washington and later even Lincoln subscribed to this idea. But the truth is, others like Thomas Jefferson really supported slavery. They defended it. John Adams wrote, "What is justice? Justice to the slave would require they should not be abandoned by their masters and turned loose upon a world in which they have no capacity." So here you have the dichotomy of thought that influenced law. And although early Americans had some odd beliefs about race, climate, physical characteristics, and the, quote, seeds of spiritual virtue, there was the widespread belief in white European superiority. There is no confusion that this informed the development of the United States as a nation-state. This is a really big subject, so I've created a timeline to help put everything into perspective. For the purpose of this lecture, we're just going to focus on slavery in territories that would become the modern U.S. Before we begin, I want you to hold in your mind two numbers, though. 12.5 million and 5 million. These are the upper thresholds of the numbers of enslaved peoples in the New World. Robert Kaczynski, one of the founders of modern vital statistics, originally estimated that as many as 15 million black Africans were captured in the slave trade. The currently accepted numbers by Patrick Manning estimate about 12.5 million were captured, but fewer made it across the transatlantic voyage due to deplorable conditions. Scholars like myself who are working on the topic of the enslavement of Native Americans are astounded to learn that the numbers could be as high as 5 million natives captured from a much smaller origin population. This doesn't include people that died due to illness or cruelty. Historians like Alan Gallay and Andres Reséndez argue that the practice was much more widespread and insidious than previously thought, and it has been concealed due to a variety of factors of anti-indigeneity. Columbus put two commercial clauses at the heart of his contract with the Spanish crown, including what can be understood like a modern-day stock option to profit from whatever he could sell in the lands he, quote, discovered. After contact, one of his very first acts was to send a ship of native slaves back to Spain. In 1492, slavery of natives was already an extreme and brutal situation, resulting in what modern scholarship understands to be more deaths than smallpox, influenza, and malaria combined. Spanish slave raids traveled across modern Caribbean, U.S. mainland, Gulf region, and Florida. By 1562, Britain joined the slave trade. Africans are shipped to what they called Hispaniola. Natives are still being captured and transported, especially by the Spanish, from across the modern Gulf Coast, the eastern coast of Mexico, and even Central America. In 1581, the first African slaves were brought to the U.S. mainland, to what was then Spanish Florida at St. Augustine. And by 1619, the first Africans were brought to the New England colonies, to Jamestown in Virginia. The enslavement of natives did not go away, but rather it coexisted with an ever-growing African slavery through the development of the triangular trade. In fact, in 1636, the colonies themselves entered into the slave trade. They built and launched the first American slave carrier, the Desire, in Massachusetts. In 1641, Massachusetts was the first colony to, quote, legalize Native and black slavery. Of course, it was already happening, but it began the process of codifying this into law, this institution into law. And right after, all of the New England Confederation followed suit. Many colonies joined this process in rapid succession. By 1663, Maryland is the first colony to pass a law creating the precedent of black slavery specifically to be in perpetuity for life. Virginia, in 1691, makes manumission illegal, abolition illegal. They passed the first anti-miscegenation laws. And then South Carolina, in the same year, passes slave codes. In 1705, Virginia's slave code codifies into law what the slave status means. It defines slavery as real estate. And then other states quickly follow that example. In 1706, Connecticut requires that all natives, blacks, and, quote, mulattoes, or mixed-race people of color, gain permission to engage in trade. 1708, Rhode Island requires that slaves must be accompanied by their masters, but among free people. And in 1710, New York forbids all natives, blacks, and mulattoes from walking at night without a lighted lantern. In 1712, New York makes it illegal for even free natives, blacks, and mixed people to own any real estate or hold any property. We're viewing this now as a gradual increase in the way that slavery has taken hold through law. Going forward to 1735, we see slavery inside the United States begin to expand. We also see it become more linked to African Americans as the practice evolved and moved south. Colonies such as Mississippi would enact black codes, which were the early foundations of later Jim Crow laws. This was all put into motion in the 1730s and 40s. First, Georgia, which had been established as a free colony, petitioned Britain to legalize slavery there in 1735. This was granted and enacted in 1738. In 1739, about 100 slaves in South Carolina took part in what is called the Stono Rebellion. Their leader, Jemmy, led an armed march south in hopes of reaching Spanish Florida. Slavery was different in New France and New Spain. It wasn't the same system of perpetuity like it had become in British America. Slaves had some rights. They could get married or even buy their freedom if they had the opportunity. And the Catholic Spanish crown had promised freedom to runaway slaves from the Anglo-Protestant territories as long as they would convert. There was an early underground railroad of sorts that went south instead of north, and this helps explain the origins of some Creole populations such as the Gullah in South Carolina and the Geechee in Florida and Georgia, as well as the vast intermixture of Black and Native peoples forming the Seminole. Tribes such as the Creeks, Cherokees, and Yamasee were integral in the process of escape. Georgia and South Carolina even attempted to invade Spanish Florida due to this. Anyway, the revolt in 1739 went terribly, and the slaves were overrun and murdered by a local militia. Multiple whites were also killed in the struggle, and due to this, surviving slaves were executed in a very gruesome way to set an example for others who might rebel. In response to the rebellion, the South Carolina legislature passed what they called the Comprehensive Negro Act of 1740, which restricted black slaves from being able to assemble in groups, raise their own food, earn money, and learn how to read and write. It also made extrajudicial murder legal. Now that's the origin of the black codes that would later permeate the South. Life on the continent began to really change with the 7 Years' War, which began in 1756. Also known as the French and Indian War, it changed colonial power structures and land holdings. The first thing that happened was the French lost their posts in Canada. Louisiana went to Spain, Florida went to England, but it also created the massive debt that was the underlying cause of the Stamp and Sugar Acts imposed upon the colonists by the British Crown. The war ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, which established a boundary, or settlement line, preventing colonists from settling west of the Appalachians. This is important because it really upset them. They wanted westward expansion into Indian lands, and they felt that England just didn't understand their wants or needs. This was a major precursor to the Revolutionary War. In 1767, Virginia's House of Burgess would boycott British trade, including the slave trade, in protest of the Townshend Acts. By 1774, the First Continental Congress had gathered, and it promised to discontinue the international slave trade to punish the British. That also met the interests of powerful planters, and it resulted in the growth of the domestic slave trade, as slaves then became an even more important commodity in intercolonial trade. In 1775, the world's first abolitionist society was founded in Philadelphia. Benjamin Franklin would later become its president in 1787. But in 1775, George Washington was the general of the Continental Army. He caved to pressure from Southern planters and announced a ban on the enlistment of all black people in the Army. Meanwhile, Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation announcing that any slave fighting on the side of the British will be liberated. This winds up having a huge impact, as we will later see. Of course, in 1776, in Philadelphia, members of the Continental Congress signed the Declaration of Independence. But that doesn't grant independence to Black and Native people, as we are aware. In 1790, Benjamin Franklin would actually petition Congress to abolish slavery, but his petition is ridiculed and tabled. 1 month later, Congress passes the Naturalization Act of 1790, and that act limited citizenship in the newly formed United States to white people. Going forward to 1819, Congress passes the Civilization Act. This aimed to assimilate free Native Americans via what amounted to a cultural genocide. What it did was it provided U.S. government funds to subsidize Protestant missionary educators in order to forcibly convert Native Americans to Christianity, move them to missions, and there was a lot of complications here, but that's important because it was part of a trend that would later materialize into actual genocide policies by Andrew Jackson and Calhoun. And in 1830, Congress would then pass the Indian Removal Act that legalized the forced removal of all natives east of the Mississippi to prisoner of war camps in the West. And that was along those, the Appalachian line that was established in the Treaty of Paris. And this is important because it was done to open up those lands which had already been settled, but opened them up for plantations, which then began the real golden age of the antebellum South. Okay, that's the broad overview. Now let's get into the specifics of the Revolutionary period and the time leading up to it. We already know from our studies in this course, and others, that during this period the colonists viewed themselves as being oppressed, taxed unfairly, and denied freedoms by England. Ironically, these same colonists who had petitioned the King of England for freedoms denied these freedoms and many more to slaves. Founding fathers like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were slaveholders and advocates of slavery. Benjamin Franklin had been a convert to the cause for emancipation. Jefferson, on the other hand, suggested that his slaves would benefit more from his kindly mastership than from actual liberation. You see, a study of Jefferson reveals a broader truth about the evolution of slavery in early America. He was aware of the contradiction between slavery and the founding principles that he espoused, but he had a paternalistic belief that slavery was for the best of those who had been enslaved. We are aware of how Enlightenment thinkers such as Thomas Paine impacted the ideological development of the United States. After the 1720s, the colonies became more distinctly North American, unique in culture, life, and politics. And as the inheritors of Enlightenment thought, the founders questioned the divine right of kings and placed importance on education, deductive reasoning, and new conversations about nature versus nurture, and the scientific concept of evidence. What is often overlooked, though, is how scientific racism also developed during this time. Naturalists and philosophers like Carl Linnaeus, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, Lecomte de Buffon, and Abbe Raynal began studying humans, grouping them into fixed categories with specific requirements, creating the concept of modern racialization. Out of this came the degeneration thesis, which propelled Jefferson's strange and often grotesque interest in natural history. He wrote extensively about Native and Black people from the perspective of a curious clinician. He also believed in distinct races and that slavery led to a degeneration or ruination of those who are enslaved. Fast forward to the Declaration of Independence. In June 1776, the colonists talked about submitting this statement of principles. They were influenced by Enlightenment thinkers such as Thomas Paine and his pamphlet, Common Sense. Many point to Thomas Paine as the intellectual godfather of the Revolution. But Thomas Paine was also one of the first and only who tried to expose the incongruity of slavery in the Age of Revolution. He wrote, "With what consistency or decency they, Americans, complain so loudly of attempts to enslave them, while they hold so many hundred thousands in slavery, and annually enslave many thousands more, without any pretense of authority or claim upon them." So let's talk about the war itself. The main themes. The fighting in the war ran from April of 1775 to November of 1782. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. The Revolution presented a difficult problem to the colonists: race and enlistment. Both individual natives and native nations, as well as free and enslaved black people, fought on both sides of the Revolution, depending on which provided the better opportunity for freedom and/or survival at the time. The War for Independence should be viewed as the largest black slave revolt in U.S. history. The role of African Americans in the Revolution can be best understood by realizing that the major loyalty was not to a place nor to a people, but to a principle. Varied and superficially contradictory activities had one common origin, one set purpose: the achievement of liberty. So, African Americans fought on both sides of the Revolutionary War. Those who fought for the British were called Loyalists. So, in November 1775, Lord Dunmore promised to free all slaves as a strategy to win the war against the American rebels. He said that anyone that would fight for the British would automatically be liberated. And this had the desired result. Between 1775 and 1783, we see a massive defection from slavery in the colonies, and it ultimately resulted in service with both forces. The development of British all-black loyalist divisions, such as the Ethiopian Regiment, which is what's pictured here to the right, wearing the Liberty to the Slave sash, and the elite Black Brigade, which served in guerrilla combat units, so were created during this time period. Black soldiers from the North served in twice the proportion to their relative population. And after, many were evacuated to Nova Scotia and London, where they were later resettled into the colony of Sierra Leone in West Africa. Sierra Leone now has a significant minority population of Creole people, who are the descendants of freed Black Americans and West Indians. Those who fought for the American side during the Revolutionary War, as we well know, are called patriots. Early in the war, Black patriots first had to fight for the right to serve for the American side. After an initial experiment of serving in the Continental Army, pressure from white Southern leaders led General Washington to purge all African American troops with an order issued on November 12, 1775. About 6 weeks later, he partially reversed this decision. This was because he was afraid he wouldn't have a large enough force to fight. Congress compromised and approved opening the army to free men of color only. This expanded after Valley Forge in the winter of 1778 to 79, leading to the development of American all-black regiments, which were inspired by stark necessity. There were some notable Black patriots. James Fordon, for example, who was born free in Philadelphia and enlisted as a sailor in the Battle of Chesapeake. Prince Whipple and Oliver Cromwell crossed the Delaware with Washington, and Agrippa Hull, who is most likely the famous of all Black patriots, enlisted in the Continental Army and served for 6 years. He became a living legend. course, there were African Americans that were neither loyalist nor patriot. Viewing things in such a binary term is reductive. It's important to see the war as rebellion. It provided the opportunity for at least 100,000 black slaves to escape, most of whom were from the Chesapeake region and the Lower South. They went all over the continent, US, Canada, into the Indian territories that were west of the Appalachians, the Caribbean, West Africa, as I mentioned earlier, Sierra Leone, and Spanish Florida and Louisiana. Okay, now we've looked at how African Americans were really divided during the Revolutionary period between loyalists and patriots, but that divide was more about what they thought was in their best interests in order to survive and to have freedom. It wasn't about the overall interests of the Americans or the British as much it was about self-determination, which really emerged as the central issue of the black struggle during this time period. Likewise, during the period leading up to and right after the Revolutionary War, after the Treaty of Paris, the concept of sovereignty became the central issue to Native Americans who were facing vast westward expansion and settlements that really disrupted the way things had been with the formation of the United States as a nation state. And some say that the Revolutionary War was actually the first American Civil War. We touched on this a little bit earlier in the course and looked at a variety of reasons for this, but when you take slavery into context, when you take racial relationships into consideration, it was the first time that the North and South really split over slavery, over what to do after the war with the slave population. There were a lot of abolitionist societies that developed in the North, whereas in the South, the expansion of the domestic slave trade really became a much more vast and intrinsic commercial exercise that was important to the Southern economy, and this clouded people's perspectives, and to many white Southerners, the war had only affirmed the status of African Americans as being presumed to be inferior and in need of slavery. Now, this is the ideology, it's terrible, and that's the ideology behind white Southern paternalism. If you're interested in this, I definitely recommend the work of historian Ira Berlin, who writes about this extensively and discusses the concept of the Revolutionary War as the first American Civil War. In Many Thousands Gone, the first 2 centuries of slavery in North America. Native Americans also really began to be pushed into obscurity during this time period. Historiographically speaking, the argument was that Indians just didn't have a place in America's founding story. Historian Ned Blackhawk reminds us of the power of what we refer to as the origin myth, when he writes that any changes to its pre-existing model would disrupt larger national teleologies of indigenous disappearance and cultural assimilation. You see, native erasure is integral to making the national story and settler colonialism work over the long term. James O'Donnell was one of the first historians that challenged this and wrote about natives in the Revolutionary War. He argued that in the North, native nations like the Iroquois remained neutral until they were pushed to take action, but in the South, the Cherokee chose the path to war despite pleas for neutrality. This isn't exactly true. The actual precursor to the Cherokee War was King George III's proclamation of 1763 and Anglo-American expansionism into Cherokee lands. Many just can't understand the native right to resistance. At the time, colonists held the prejudiced view that the Cherokee were a murderous, duplicitous people who acted out of the, quote, baseness of their nature, rather than in self-defense from land theft and colonial attack. Thomas Jefferson best represented this opinion when he advocated for the mass murder or displacement of the Cherokee as well as all 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy as consequence for their non-passivity and becoming involved in the war. In Jefferson's 1776 letter to the president of the Virginia Convention, Edmund Pendleton, he wrote, "I hope that the Indians will now be driven beyond the Mississippi. This, then, is the season for driving them off, and our southern colonies are happily rid of them and may exert their whole force." The inclusion of native peoples in the American story is only one part of the equation of recognizing Native Americans as a multifaceted, three-dimensional people and cultures that had an impact on historical events and nation-state foundation. It wasn't until the last 20 years post the cultural and linguistic turns when histories as an academy's approach began to recognize other minorities' histories that it was possible to challenge the narrow juxtaposition of exclusion versus villainy and tell history inclusive of any semblance of native perspective. Historian Colin Calloway was one of the first to do this and to challenge reductionism, which is important because it allows people to view native peoples with complexity and a glimpse of humanity. It also confronts the false idea of the monolithic. Like African Americans, Native Americans, both as nations and individual, as free and as slaves, had different motivations, alliances, goals, and needs, and acted out of their own best interest for freedom and for survival. In conclusion, the aftermath of the war saw many changes: organized anti-slavery movements in the North, some emancipation, and a growing population of free people of color. Right after the war, the Northwest Ordinance made black slavery illegal in the new Western territories. Unfortunately, this led to a revitalization of the enslavement of Native Americans. This is what I'm working on in my research. And of course, it also led to a lot of American violence against Native peoples. After the war, the antebellum period also begins, and with the opening of those lands for the development of plantations, we see the monumental growth of a more rigid, dehumanizing black slavery in the South. This is the slavery in most people's imaginations when they think of the subject. I'm sorry the lecture ran a little bit long. As you can tell, the topic of race and slavery in early America into the Revolutionary period is vast, and it's important. The Revolution itself had a really big impact on the lives of people of color in the emerging United States. It also impacted the nation-state itself in monumental ways, and that has implications for the society and country we live in today. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me via email. Thank you so much.